One bad barrel of apples could mean a family went hungry by February. Before refrigerators, before electricity, an entire winter came down to roughly 10 weeks each autumn. 10 weeks to harvest every crop, slaughter the livestock, and preserve enough food to survive until spring. Everything hinged on beating one deadline, the first hard freeze, using methods most of us have completely forgotten. The first hard freeze was more than a weather event. It was the finish line in a race that decided whether a family would eat well or go hungry by February. Farmers watched the thermometer, counting down the days as October slipped into November. The rule was simple. When the temperature hit 32 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 nights in a row, the ground would lock up. No more digging, no more moving barrels, no second chances. Almanacs pinned the average freeze somewhere between October 20th and November 10th, but every year brought its own surprises. A cold snap in late October, a lingering warm spell that turned the soil to mud, or a sudden storm that left barrels soaked and ruined. Every task on the farm was mapped against that invisible deadline. Early September meant pulling beans and peas while the soil was still loose. By mid-September, late root crops such as turnips, carrots, and parsnips were planted for a final push, left to fatten underground until just before the freeze. Late September brought the family hog's last day, with every part salted, smoked, or rendered into lard before the cold set in. October was a blur of canning, drying, and hauling. By early November, the final cellar stocking began. Roots lifted, apples packed in straw, barrels rolled into place and sealed tight. One diary from Vermont's Whitman farm captures the mood. October 28th, cellar full, barrels lined, doors shut against the frost. Prayed the apples hold until March. Every barrel, every bushel, every sealed door was a bet placed against the winter to come. There was no margin for error. The ground would soon be iron, and whatever lay inside the cellar had to last until the world thawed again. Root cellars were more than just holes in the ground. They were carefully engineered lifelines. Builders worked with the Earth's natural insulation, digging deep enough to reach stable temperatures between 40 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Thick stone, brick, or even sod walls, sometimes layered with sawdust or straw, helped blunt the wild swings of winter and spring. Humidity mattered just as much as cold. 85 to 95% was the sweet spot, high enough to keep carrots and turnips from shriveling, but not so damp that mold would creep in overnight. Inside, the cellar was a world of zones and strategies. Potatoes and carrots rested in sand-filled bins along the coolest floor, insulated with a layer of damp straw. Cabbages dangled upside down from wooden rafters, their outer leaves drying to form a natural shield around the tender heart. Apples and pears, which gave off ethylene gas that could spoil other crops, were stashed in separate crates lined with straw, often in a corner with its own airflow. Winter squash preferred a slightly warmer, drier spot, sometimes just a shelf near the door. Ventilation was the silent guardian. A two-pipe system, with one vent low to bring in fresh air and another high to let out moist, stale air, kept the atmosphere balanced. This steady exchange prevented condensation and rot and carried away the gases that signaled trouble. Mercury thermometers hung at different heights and were checked weekly, giving early warning if the temperature crept too low or too high. When a cold snap threatened, families might even light a single bulb or lantern for warmth, just enough to hold the line above freezing. With these measures, a well-built cellar could keep roots, fruits, and tubers fresh for 4 to 8 months. In a world without backup, this underground microclimate was the first and most reliable layer of defense against hunger. Late autumn brought the farm's most urgent and communal task: turning fresh pork into a winter lifeline. As soon as the first frost made outdoor temperatures reliably cold, the family gathered for slaughter day, with the men handling the butchering, the women preparing the salt, and the older children stacking barrels and marking lids. Every piece of pork was weighed, then packed with coarse salt at a precise ratio of 3% by weight. This was not guesswork. Too little salt, and the meat would spoil before Christmas. Too much, and it became nearly inedible. The salted cuts were pressed into oak barrels, layer by layer, each tier covered with more salt, then sealed tight with a heavy wooden lid and a weighted board to keep air and pests out. Over the next 4 to 6 months, the salt slowly drew out moisture, creating a briny shield that stopped bacteria in their tracks. The result was shelf-stable pork that would last until spring, ready for the table, even when the cellar was snowed in. For many families, this was the difference between a full larder and a winter of want. Smokehouses stood apart from the main house, squat and sturdy, their thick stone or log walls built to trap both heat and flavor. Inside, hams, bacon, and sausages dangled from wooden rafters, each piece carefully spaced to catch the rising smoke without touching its neighbor. The design was deliberate: a single fire pit on the packed dirt floor, a narrow vent at the roof's peak, and few, if any, windows, all to keep the smoke swirling low and slow. Hickory was the wood of choice in much of New England and the Midwest, prized for its strong, sweet aroma that clung to pork and fish alike. Along the coast and in orchard country, applewood brought a milder, fruitier note, and in some towns, debates over the right blend could last all winter. The smoking process took patience, sometimes 2 weeks, sometimes 4, depending on the cut and the weather. As the smoke curled upward, it did more than flavor the meat. Phenols and aldehydes in the smoke formed a barrier against bacteria and insects, sealing the flesh for months to come. For many families, the smokehouse was a second line of defense after the salt barrel, a way to make sure that even if one method failed, the other might carry them through until spring. Once the meat was smoked, it might stay hanging in the rafters or move to the cellar, wrapped in cloth, ready for the leanest weeks of winter. Glass jars and dry bins became the backbone of the farm pantry as autumn closed in. In 1858, John Mason patented a screw-top glass jar with a rubber ring, a simple invention that let families seal summer's bounty behind a vacuum-tight lid. Tomatoes, pickles, applesauce, and jams, all high-acid foods, could be packed hot, capped, and boiled in a water bath. As the jars cooled, the rubber ring compressed, drawing a vacuum that kept air and bacteria out. This method worked well for fruits and pickles, but canning low-acid vegetables or meat required extra caution. By the early 1900s, extension bulletins warned of botulism risk, pushing for pressure canners and strict boiling times. Still, a shelf lined with clear jars, each holding the color of August, was a point of pride and a hedge against hunger. Dry staples needed a different kind of engineering. Grains such as wheat, oats, and corn were stored in elevated wooden bins lined with tarred canvas, set high on stone piers to keep out ground damp and rodents. Tight-fitting lids and metal fly screens blocked pests, while sawdust or sand on the floor absorbed stray moisture. Beans and peas, dried on strings in the barn loft, were packed into cloth sacks and hung from ceiling beams, safe from mice and mold. Milling was done in small batches because grinding too much at once could heat the grain and spoil the flour. Every bin, every jar, was a silent promise that, come February, there would still be bread and beans to eat. Fermentation and ice brought the final layer of winter insurance to the farm, blending chemistry, tradition, and community effort. In German and Scandinavian households across the Midwest, making sauerkraut was a yearly ritual. Cabbage, harvested after the first frost, was shredded and packed into large stoneware crocks with just enough salt, about 2 to 2.5% by weight, to draw out water and create a brine. Over 6 to 8 weeks in the cool cellar, lactic acid bacteria transformed the cabbage, lowering the pH and preserving it for months. The process was as much social as scientific. Neighbors often gathered for a shared kraut making, each family tending their own crock, but working side by side. Meanwhile, ice houses stood ready for their winter harvest. As ponds thickened with ice, teams cut blocks weighing 50 to 100 pounds and hauled them to storage. Each block was packed in dry sawdust, layer upon layer, inside a shaded, insulated building. The sawdust slowed melting, letting the ice last well into spring. For families with access, this cold reserve kept butter, milk, and even fresh meat safe long after the cellars emptied. Together, the crock and the ice house offered a final safeguard, a buffer against the last, leanest weeks before the world thawed. By the 1930s, only around 1 in 10 rural homes had electricity. But within 2 decades, that number soared to nearly 3/4 thanks to sweeping electrification projects. The refrigerator, once a $150 luxury, dropped to just $39 by 1948. As cold came with the flip of a switch, the knowledge of barrel packing, ice cutting, and cellar building faded fast. Yet not everyone was ready to let those skills vanish. Ellie Harper, facing a sharp drop in corn prices, rebuilt her farm's brick arch cellar and returned to salt pork and sawdust ice. Miguel Alvarez, troubled by the carbon footprint of modern appliances, dug a sod cellar and revived old fermentation rituals. Sarah Thompson, a living history curator, now teaches smokehouse construction and canning to school groups. For each, the revival isn't just nostalgia. It's about food security, taste, and carrying forward a tradition of resilience. For generations, these preservation skills meant the difference between sustenance and hunger. Today, as interest in self-reliance and resilience grows, their value resurfaces. The ingenuity that once fed families through winter now challenges us. In an age of convenience, what knowledge do we risk losing, and what might we need again?